This is Ian Williams of the Foreign Press Association in New York, and coming towards the end of over a long year of COVID now, and it was an inadvertent opportunity for us because we found the Zoom press conferences to be very satisfying. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to get a venue. The speakers don't have to be transported. So it is a format that we will continue. When we've considered this at the Foreign Press, we thought that really, unless you are getting together for something solid like a meal or a drink, there's not that much reason to do stuff in person anymore. It's much easier to do it this way. So it was a great deal of pleasure. My old friend, colleague, and indeed neighbor, until she fled the plague-ridden city to leave those of us behind and live up in the clean air of the mountains where the rats can't reach and whatever else, take the plague. So Nina is talking to us today from her mountaintop area where she's safe. But she's already had the injection, as have I, and we're considering broader prospects. And it's very timely because her book is Virus, Vaccinations, the CDC, and the Hijacking of America's Response to the Pandemic. And there we go. It's very timely. Obviously, you were rushed because it's sort of the ink is still wet on your typewriter as well as on the book. But
perfect length, Ian. 50,000 words, perfect length, perfect amount of time to do it. And I'll probably never write a longer one again.
Well, that's a good idea, yes.
That's the way to do it. Sit in your chair. I mean, I know I'm not talking to writing students, but sit in your chair with a defined amount of time and just write like the wind and then revise. And it was a great experience.
Yeah, my book on Bush was conceived like that. It was 3 months to the first phone call to delivery of the manuscript.
Yeah, that's about what this is.
Yeah, and it meant that I didn't sleep much, but working around the clock, it's satisfying when you do it. There's nothing like a real deadline to get you moving.
And in the dead of winter, it would have been difficult to do it right this time of year because it's too beautiful out, but it was snowy up here. Actually, it was kind of difficult to stay in the chair because there was terrific snow here. I don't know if the Northeast had better snow because of the pause, or if it was just a lucky year, but it was a lovely winter, and now it's a lovely spring.
Well, this is the fruits of your work on it, and I was very impressed. I'm going to quote an earlier guest of ours, Craig Unger, who you might remember, American Compromat, about Donald Trump's relation to the KGB. Said, Nina Burleigh's Virus is a fast-paced narrative that captures the spirit of our dystopian times. He's an experienced blurb writer. In doing so, he transformed the battle of science against a deadly pathogen into one pitting the fact-based world against the dark forces of paranoid cults, cynical political calculation, and greed in a senseless war that caused hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths. Now, they don't make blurbs like that no more, do they? Expand on it.
What more needs to be said?
Well, a little more, a bit more flesh on it. I mean, as I read it, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, we'd lived through the Trump reaction. We're watching it, and it's in retrospect, it's like a train crash or a car crash, and I've been in both of them, so I know about these things. You don't really get the idea of what's happening and all the horror. It's only when you take a step backwards and put the time frame and you can see how awful and avoidable so much of it was. I mean, the Trump administration, they didn't really want to inflict a plague on everybody. They didn't want 600,000 people to die, but they may as well have done because their actions did it. This is the gist of what you're saying. They consciously dismissed the possibility this was likely to be and then made it possible, but with their dismissal.
Well, I agree with that to some extent. I think it was more deliberate than you're letting it out to be. But you're right. I mean, the reason I wrote the book, other than having been asked by the publisher to write a book about the vaccine, I said I would as long as I could write one part of it about what happened at the government level, because as you just said, we sat here in March and April and May and the rest of the year with our jaws on the floor, watching what was going on, going, wait, what just happened? They're not going to, activate the government, the force of the government to become a sole purchaser in order to get needed equipment. No, they're going to make the states fight each other. They're going to go by supply and demand, by the laws of supply and demand, the free market ideology that the one of the pillars of the Trump administration really was based on. Smash the state and let private enterprise handle all of these things. And the other thing that was going on was that they had, and in this case, that they probably didn't deliberately, obviously, predict that there was going to be a virus, but they, in order to pay back the white evangelical Christians who got them into power, they gave the public health agencies to the white evangelical Christians. So you had Pence in charge of COVID, you had evangelical Christian Price, and then evangelical Azar in charge of HHS. And Azar, I didn't know this when this was all going on. I thought he was just sort of a pharma lobbyist toady, but he actually is another evangelical Christian who was the sponsor of Ralph Drollinger's really Christo-fascist ministry, running the cabinet Bible study meetings in the White House throughout the administration. So Azar was right in with these guys. Now, why did they give them the public health agencies? Because the white evangelical Christians care more about policing morality through sex habits and so on than they do anything else. So they were busy making religious liberty exemptions for the HHS and for pharmacists who didn't want to serve contraception, or for bakers who didn't want to, for let's say doctors who didn't want to deal with transgender people. They were focused on that. That's what their eye was on, and on making sure nobody got an abortion. So instead, they were not paying attention to a virus that was coming, that was going to crash into our shores and kill more people than the three last wars altogether.
It wasn't
undefended, and they were undefended because their eye was on something else. And then once the pandemic was here, the free marketeers saw an opportunity. And the 1-6 has taken all the gas out of the, as you said, we watched it happen. We couldn't understand it. Now we're sort of getting, my book, puts at least in context one part of this story, how they messed it up. We don't have we don't have a special commission, a 9/11 type commission or anything looking back on what these contracts were, who got the money, who, what crony ended up with what cash, what friends of Kushner have hooked up to the feeding trough of the federal government. We don't know any of that, and we are probably never going to know any of it unless there is an agency, or there's an inspector general's group that's set up to monitor the trillions that have been passed by Congress. But that's not the same thing as what was going on early on in the pandemic, when they were giving out no bid contracts with, not going through any of the system's checks and balances that are normally applied to government contracting.
There's a form of neoliberal internationalism here, because this was precisely what was happening in Britain as well.
I have no doubt that it was happening in Britain. I actually have seen in the last few days, because I've been talking and writing about this, I have seen emails and tweets at me saying, "Oh yeah, this is just what happened in the UK too." So yeah, it's not certainly not. We're not the only country where this happened, but my focus was on the US. My focus was not on, somebody else asked me, a Swedish economist friend of mine asked me something about the conspiracy theories and the anti-vaxxers here. And I had just written this thing yesterday, or published this piece of the chapter on anti-vaxxers and conspiracy theories. And he said, well, if that's true in the US, why isn't this true in Italy and France? And I don't know. I'm not writing about Italy and France. I'm writing about the United States and the culture of the United States responding to this pandemic. It may be there are things that are similar or exactly the same worldwide. I mean, that's one of the lessons that the sort of lessons of this that I think will maybe allow us to move forward a little bit, is that because of the internet, every single person who has a phone was able to understand in real time that every other human being on this planet was experiencing the same vulnerability and going through the same lockdowns and maskings or not to mask, and what should we do, and what are the medicines we can take, and how can we help our elderly. All of this is a species-wide event, and if anything good comes out of it, it will be that we understood for the first time, really, we are the first generation to have this type of communications, that we are not alone, that we're part of this species, and we're all vulnerable. And again, with the vaccines right now, what's happening in India, if it keeps going in India, it's just going to resurge back elsewhere. Everyone has to be lifted up with these vaccines, and the vaccines are certainly the mRNA vaccines are.
It helps
miraculous.
If we're all connected. That's nice, but it doesn't really help if you're on the deck of the Titanic and you can feel the cold water around all of your feet together and you can share the pain. It's going down just as surely. And look at India, look at Brazil, look at Britain, look at here, and it's not that it's a coordinated response, but there's a similar anti-scientific response. And you go into the science of where it all comes from. What is it that led the 21st century, where the Chinese have got a robot wandering around the moon, to have America groveling in the Dark Ages with pitchforks and tumbrils?
Well, okay, there are a couple reasons. I mean, first of all, in this country, we have a terrible healthcare system. It's disparate. It's not state organized. So there's no central authority. There was no central authority to order testing or masking or anything. And that was never going to be something that would happen here.
Well, there was, but it was prevented from acting, because the prevailing wisdom is that governments are hateful, disdainful, should be kept at arm's length unless they're locking you up.
Even if I think, even if another, well, let's just say, I personally think that this administration massively messed it up and deliberately messed up some of the things, almost criminally. And I have been asked, would another administration have done better? And I do think they would. I don't agree with people who are saying, oh, it's the system's doesn't work. I do think that there are aspects of this system that made it different from China. Your specific question about why we're not like China, we don't have that kind of state authority here. You can't even get everybody to mask. But if there had been a leadership that relied on science and that spoke out early and often and got behind the masking, instead of saying to the U.S. Postal Service, no, don't send masks to every family in the United States, which they were about to do because we don't want to be in a panic situation, because it was an election year and he wanted the numbers low. Don't forget that that's what he said in March. That's how I opened the book at the CDC. When
he didn't want the cases low. He wanted the reported numbers low. He wanted the numbers low.
He didn't want he didn't want the numbers to go up in that period of time. And it was already creeping around in California and New York and other places. And there was nowhere to get tested.
That was specifically the cruise ship, wasn't it? He didn't want the cruise ship to be let land because it would push the numbers up in California. Same number of people ill as before.
That was the moment at which he said that. But there's no doubt that he wanted that to be the case for as long as possible, because all they cared about was maintaining power. And as long as it was an election year, if they could keep the numbers low and keep people thinking that it was a hoax and it was no worse than the flu, then maybe they could sneak by if they could keep the stock market up, right? So they didn't get away with that. But that was part of the anti-science thing. And then the other is, I mean, there are many factors here. For decades, you have had industries like the sugar industry or the tobacco industry, or now fossil fuels, which are spewing out fake or contradictory facts, so alternative facts into the public stream. So people don't know what to believe. So science facts are all malleable, as you know, Kellyanne Conway famously told us, you know, there are alternate facts. And that was one. So there's anti-science in that active anti-science science being fabricated by these industries. And then that has entered the mainstream so that people, a significant number of people, not the majority of people, but the significant number of Americans are scornful of experts. That went right along with MAGA, scorn for expertise, scorn for PhDs. Grandpa did it the way he did it, then so I'm going to do it my way. This kind of the liberty sloganeering, the whole sort of movement, the MAGA movement was anti-expert, anti-science. And, you know, we know that when the administration took over in January 2017, when they stepped into those offices, like the Department of Energy, they kicked out the physicists and put in friends of Eric Trump. You know, I mean, this was an it was a crony capital administration. It was all about business and making money, and it wasn't about inconvenient facts. So there was that underpinning to all of this. And then, of course, you had the conspiracy theorists, which I have a theory on why they proliferate. And then further, the final thing, I wrote about this yesterday in the Times, I think that we, you know, part of my book is on the history of vaccines and how this mRNA vaccine is, why it's so different. And it's fascinating. Up to about 250 years ago, until 250 years ago, throughout human history, we have been utterly unprotected from things like this, from infectious diseases, utterly unprotected. We could pray to the supernatural being, or we could, you know, hope that that the asteroid that went by or the comet that went by didn't foretell a plague coming. We could pin toads to our, you know, in Daniel Defoe's book, The Journal of the Plague Year, in London in the 17th century, they pinned toads to their collars to keep the plague at bay. You could, you know, just quack cures and so. So up till 250 years ago, that's how humans responded to this. Then we got the vaccine era, and especially in the 20th century, the vaccines have enabled so many people to survive, so many children to survive that wouldn't have, or at least would have been very sick around the turn of the 20th century. So nobody born after 1950 has any conception of what vaccines rescued us from. We are totally spoiled by these vaccines, the 15 that they jab babies with now. Nobody knows what diphtheria is. We hardly know how to pronounce it. There are all of these diseases that no longer plague children in this northern.
I was of the era that came up, and people
gone.
had scarlet fever, mumps, measles,
yes,
chicken pox. I've had most of those, in fact, personally.
I barely get any of that. And yes, in the UK and post-war England, it was probably, you know, just like here, there was polio outbreaks. Now we don't even know what this is. So we're spoiled, and that very spoiledness has led us to be dismissive of what, you know, vaccines can do, and also has let us believe that we can do our own DIY medical care. We all can have an opinion on it. You know, this stuff is unnatural, so I'm not going to inject myself with unnatural. Well, lots of things are unnatural that you're eating. Everything is, you know, bananas are filled with chemicals. So
do not read your cornflakes packets ingredients if you want to eat naturally.
So yeah, there are a lot of things, Ian, that come together behind this anti-science situation, and that leave us with, I don't know what now, is it still 1 in 4 Americans saying they're not going to get vaccinated? We'll never reach herd immunity because people just are turning it down. And well,
there is a tendency amongst some people to think, well, this is Darwinian. They're the ones we want to get rid of anyway. Let them go. But that's harsh. We're not like that, are we?
Well, I mean, the Trump administration, I argue, was like that. I think they did think that. I mean, Robert Mercer, Steve Bannon's great financier, is on record. You know, he's one step away from openly espousing eugenics. You know, that people, if we pay for education or if we pay for people's medicine, we're weakening the herd, we're lifting up the weak. You know, I mean, this is the mindset of a lot of these people. So I argue in the book that this thing has been eugenic in effect, and it's not something that they were opposed to, actually. And you know, so we're living with we can see it. I mean, you could see that the poor and the brown were felled by this, while the rich and the fat and the white, Trump and Giuliani and Christie and Ben Carson, got the cocktail hour. That kept them alive.
Well, that's an issue that I'd like to have seen a bit more on. Trump eventually got the disease that didn't exist, found it was little more than the flu, without eating his words, went into hospital. What treatment did they get? Because it appears from your book that they got sort of very special, I mean, they got very special treatment in terms of doctors. I didn't see them fighting off, you guys are scientists, get away from me.
Well,
bring me a Bible instead.
First of all, they got tested, and most people couldn't get these tests for a long time. Secondly, they got, the Operation Warp Speed put most of its billions into the vaccine process, the creation of the vaccines. So 18 billion, I think, went to the vaccines, and about 4 billion was to the therapeutic efforts. And so there were some of these therapeutic, they call it the cocktail. You know, they would mix in some antibodies with some steroids, with some special other things. And they got, infused with this. The infusion was not something that anybody could just get. If you were in California gasping your final breaths in a crowded hallway of a hospital while Trump was getting his cocktail, those people could not get that cocktail. They weren't going to be able to get that. Nobody had this infusion. Nobody had an hour or two to give that to every patient. They didn't have enough of it. So, Kushner would pick up the phone, or, Ben needs it. Okay. So Ben Carson goes in, Trump gets it. And that in itself is obscene.
And the fact that they immediately went off wobbling against advice into the open air and infected the Secret Service agents and everybody else about it.
I opened the book with the example of, I say you can start in a lot of places, but one place you could start is in the White House, in the hospital, where the White House security chief is having his leg sawed off because he caught COVID in the mask-free Trump White House. I mean, these things had real effects in that community, not just in that community, in the greater community, among the people in Pennsylvania across the river, and people around here who believed in Trump, who believed that it was just the flu. They weren't masking. You could cross the river last summer and go 10 miles in, and you would go to the Walmart and people weren't wearing masks. Now they are. But, all last summer.
You didn't get a chance to interview the security head and see whether he'd changed his mind since he'd lost a leg?
I didn't try. I mean, I know
it's a bit tasteless, but we're journalists. We have to do these.
He was an employee, though, Ian. I mean, I don't think he had his choice. That's not a changing your mind thing. He was an employee of the government, as were these Secret Service guys who obviously they're healthier. Maybe they survived. I haven't heard of Secret Service guys dying, but they were catching it left and right in that community.
Now, Albert Goldson is just, how is Big Pharma complicit? It's an interesting question, because normally you, I, or many others look at the pharma companies as the evil demons. But did they turn up trumps? We got a vaccine in record time. I mean, that's you say that in the book. This is unprecedented. Vaccines are usually years in the making and testing. And this was turned round in no time at all. Biochemically speaking,
this was the success story of throwing that money at them. They picked 6 companies, and Pfizer turned it down. Moderna took it, and then Johnson & Johnson, Novavax. I can't remember the other ones. 2 others, and they took 3 different platforms. So the mRNA, the adenovirus, and the third one, which I'm blanking on now, which we're not using, I don't think. J&J might be the third one, actually. No, that's the adenovirus. Anyway, they threw the money at them, and they said, we'll pay you whether it works or not. You just make it, and make a lot of it, and we'll shield you from litigation. And that was the magic. That's the magic trick. They gave it.
It's not quite the free market at work.
Pardon me?
It's not quite the free market at work.
It's not. It's not the free market at work. It's absolutely not the free market at work. It's the state. It's the state saying, here, do this. We're going to give you a lot of money, but it's not the free market.
Who decided?
And then when they got the money, when they got the vax figured out, and the clinical trials were positive, those company chiefs timed the release of the information on the 95% effectiveness of Moderna and Pfizer. They timed that release to stock sales of their own. And millions and millions were made off of this. Private fortunes have been made off of this. Meanwhile, the actual inventors of it, like Barney Graham at the NIH, or Catalin Carrico, who actually is getting some money from Pfizer, they don't own the patents. And these people who were instrumental in making it, this, years and years of science lead to this, years and years of little experiments and work on, in obscure labs that to try to figure out how to get this substance, this mRNA, past the enzymes that would destroy it in the body, and then past the immune system. So they did there's a lot of work done early on this.
Who decided which platform went to which of the bidders?
I think the bidders had the platforms. For sure, Moderna and Pfizer already had these platforms. They were already working, not the platform, already working in this area. They were making, the other thing about the history of vaccines is it's not lucrative. So a lot of the industries, the big pharma was out of vaccine making. There were only like 7 companies left doing it. And they were really not, it's not lucrative because you have to make a lot of it, but it's only administered once and then you're done. So people aren't buying it over and over again, like you would be with a very expensive cancer drug which you needed to be infused with daily or something. That's what they were making with this miraculous substance, the messenger RNA. They were working on very, very high-end special drugs to work with cancer and other, intractable ailments. And then they decided, we'll make this vaccine. They knew that they could probably do it. In fact, one of the great sort of optimistic parts of this is that they had the mRNA, the substance that's in these vaccines that is effective, the little strand of proteins.
The messenger RNA, yeah.
They had that already made, or designed 3 days after the Chinese sent the genome over. So they knew, they had the code. They had the code of what this thing was, the spike protein, and they had this thing within 3 days. So that bodes well for future virus and pandemics, because if in fact we have another, as they're predicting, we'll have many more of these things. I don't know if they're going to come more frequently or not. Some believe that because of our travel and our connectedness. But if something were to be found again, and it was very transmissible, they could, in theory, build one of these very quickly again. Now, whether they would make, whether they'd be able to make billions of shots, which they haven't done here, because obviously that's why we have India and Brazil not covered. But it does suggest that human science, human medicine has really it's advanced to such a degree that it's just astonishing, and that's kind of the good side of the story, that we now know what we can do with all of this genetic science that has leaped ahead in the last 2 decades.
There's Tajinder Singh, you mentioned India, Brazil, and do you have any comments on the failure of Narendra Modi in India on the testing and vaccination drive? Because right at the beginning of the epidemic here, we were talking to the American Funeral Directors Association. We were ahead of the curve on this one, and they were talking about the trenches being dug in the parks and the potter's field that was being extended and the bodies backing up in the morgues.
Unforgivable.
In India, they're all over the beaches of the Ganges, where half-burned bodies are surfacing because they really can't cope with the death log.
Well, what are you going to say? I understand that India. I mean, wasn't researching this as much as I was the U.S., but India managed somehow to elude the first big wave of this, and they did something right, and then they relaxed everything. And I still, I don't particularly like Modi or what I know of that system there or his politics, but he could be forgiven, and those people could be forgiven in theory, because everyone thought they had eluded it. Even the New Yorker had a huge story about it. Remember, in like February, look, how did India get away? What did they do right? Maybe people are immune to it there. Maybe they've had some diseases, childhood disease that kept them immune. Remember that there were actual serious scientists talking about this. So you could have, if you were an Indian leader, somewhat relied on that concept that maybe we've got some special thing in our blood, or I don't know. But yeah, I mean, they definitely have messed it up terribly, and it is it's atrocious. It's tragic to witness. I mean, that Arundhati Roy piece in The Guardian the other day was just heartbreaking. And I haven't followed what's going on there this week, but my heart goes out to the people there, because it must be terrifying.
Well, one of the other things is that if it weren't for the lockdown, would we have seen sort of tumbrils and flaming torches on the streets here? Because the effects have been almost directed. You almost suspect the geneticists with the Steve Bannon and the others were eugenically directing this. Frank Gomez points out the disproportionate pandemic effect on minorities and women and the failure to recognize and deal with it. I mean, to what extent can you suggest that this neglect was purposeful? It's only them dying. We shouldn't really put that much effort up.
Absolutely. I'm sorry. I mean, at the Trump administration level, absolutely. We have Kushner on record, I think, or at least quoted without denial, saying, well, it's the blue state governor's problem. They really did this calculation that it wasn't going to affect their people. And of course, that boomeranged and backfired, because it did start, it got to the Dakotas and Arizona and places like that. But even so, I mean, it was the poor, the frontline workers, anybody who could get away from having to be face to face with people, with other humans, did. And if you couldn't do that, you were most likely on the low end.
You had to travel on the train to work in a crowded hospital.
You were most likely on the low end of the pay scale. You weren't people who could just work from home. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of it. Unfortunately, racism and absolutely, the racism and attitudes towards the poor. I mean, poor white people died of it as well. We know that. But the poor and the brown,
who often happen as a Venn diagram, they often happen to occupy the same space.
That's right.
We find. How did this? This was going on in the background of the WHO, the CDC, and China. What about the absolute failure for the CDC, for example? I think you say deliberately refused tests that came from the WHO and instead produced an all-American but failed test and had to go back and start.
Yes, let's remind ourselves of how that came about. So was starting with earlier in the Trump administration. They quickly got on as soon as he was elected, they went down that road of disentangling us from these leeches, the potentially world dominating global organizations like the UNHCR and the WHO, anybody who wasn't particularly friendly enough to Israel, out the door, all of these. So all of those organizations, the UN related global organizations, we were already receding from. And so the WHO coming in and saying, okay, here's what, now we have a global health problem. And guess what? We have a test for it. Oh, they just loved to say no to that. That was part of the, playing to the crowd. We aren't going to have the WHO give us their test. Who's the WHO? We're not going to be part of this global, Chinese global domination. Or as I don't watch Fox very often. I happened to be in a hotel a couple nights ago and I saw Laura Ingraham talking about masks and social distancing and how now that we have the vaccine, they're still telling us we have to do this. And then somehow she manages to get in, some faceless bureaucrat in Brussels is telling us what to do. It's like they could always use the
Brexiteer.
Brussels, then you can sort of get like some applause. It's a crowd pleaser. So these ideas that they have they're memes with them really about the WHO, European stuff.
But there was some clumsy footwork to begin with. I mean, certainly the WHO was paying far too much attention to China when China was ducking and weaving at the beginning. We actually had the CDC chief from Taiwan on a press conference at the time who explained that their warnings were ignored and their attempts to get a voice into the WHO were ignored because of the Chinese fear of Chinese repercussions.
The Chinese, the WHO. The problem with the way the Trump's the xenophobia of the Trump administration happening to coincide with this event is that nobody could really talk about when he was president, when they were running the place. You couldn't really talk about the things that China did wrong, and also this question of whether they didn't have safety measures in that lab, because I think that is now becoming more and more of a consensus among scientists. I interviewed some of them, that you cannot rule out that there wasn't something in that lab that given what they were working on, given the amount of these bad things that they had in there, you cannot rule out that this didn't somehow end up in a garbage can accidentally. I mean, one of David Relman, Stanford microbiologist who's come out on this, has said, in labs, often they do these experiments where they're trying to increase the power of the virus, or they're just, they're testing it to see if it can become human oriented, these gain of function things. And he said, often, you'll have a petri dish and you think nothing happened, like it didn't work. So they just throw it away. And the problem is you might throw something away that had a little bit of it on it. And these are questions that, the WHO basically let China walk away without going in and investigating it fully. We know they just did that. And secondly, according to David Relman and other scientists I've talked to, and you can see them talking about it in public as well, the scientific community, especially the virology community in the labs, if this is something that came out of a lab, again, accidentally, I don't think that anybody wanted this to happen. How can you possibly not then look at your own labs and think you have to reconstruct everything that you know about safety in them? And so I don't think it'll ever be identified as what, if it is that. It won't be in our lifetime. That will never be acknowledged. But I think it's something that they cannot rule it out. And so, yes, back to so the WHO has its problems. It definitely has its problems. And the WHO was also involved in the whole masking, not masking fiasco, which early on really set the tone, because when they changed their minds, you had all these people out here who thought,
well, the
well, why are they
question,
doing that? They told us not to wear them, and now you're telling us to wear them. And so a lot of people thought it was just a bunch of
the mask issue, I thought, was crucial at the time. Did they say people shouldn't use masks because there's a shortage of masks and they wanted to keep them for the critical workers, or was it because they thought they were ineffective? But they were being dishonest in either case, weren't they?
No, well, they weren't 100%. I listened to a podcast about this. Zainab Tufekci, I don't know how to pronounce her name. Terrific writer, sometimes seen in the Times, medical historian or anthropologist, sociologist. She's got the goods on this. And she said, some of the doctors really did think they were bad for you at that point. They weren't even just saying, no, we need the PPE for our medical people. They really thought that they would cause harm, because then people would behave. If you felt like you were protected by a mask, then you wouldn't socially distance enough, because they didn't know how it was transmitted yet.
It's a bit like saying cigarettes should be sold without filters.
Yes.
Because it doesn't show how bad they are immediately.
Yeah.
It's medical mistrust, mismanagement as well of how people react to these things. Yes. And when we're coming towards the conclusion, what do you think it's over?
Do I think the pandemic is over?
Well, in India, they thought it was over, and
I don't know. I don't know. I kind of think, look, they're opening New York, my grocery store here up in the country.
That's what worries me. I'm still not going to breathe the air.
I just walked in there today, this morning. I couldn't believe it. This big sign says, CDC guidelines say if you've been vaccinated, you can come in here without a mask. So I pulled it down for the first time in months. I just thought, I'll test this out. And it felt really weird. And a lot of people did have their masks on, but I don't know. I don't know.
Do you trust people? If you've got people who are so deluded that they didn't think they needed masks, are they going to admit that they had a vaccine or not?
The problem. I think I don't know. I see sort of the logic of this, because I feel like that may, if you get where you actually have to show that you were vaccinated before you can go into a play or a movie or a baseball game or something, that might push people who aren't vaccinated over the line. So I think that might be a logical way to go, for logical reason for why they're doing this, but I don't know.
Isn't this a bit like saying that you have to wear a seatbelt unless you're a careful driver?
Yeah, it just doesn't make sense. I don't know. Again, I don't know.
Every driver thinks they're above average. We know that.
Yeah. I'm not.
So you don't have to wear a seatbelt.
But I think that I honestly think that most of what they're doing right now has to be focused on getting people to stick their arms out and getting the needle in it. I think that everything they're doing has to be focused on that, because, well, there are variants being hatched in bodies all over the place in this planet right now. And will those variants invariably get over here? Yes. Will they elude the vaccine at some point? Presumably. It's like the flu vaccine. Flu vaccine doesn't work year after year. So I don't know. I sometimes think maybe we're just in a little interlude here, that at the end of the summer or the fall, we might see something not so good happening. But I do believe in these vaccines. I think they're amazing. I really do. It's a feat that they were able to pull this off in 11 months.
Mm.
It's a real
medical engineering. I've had my vaccines and I'm prepared to go along with them, but I still don't trust everybody else. And,
yeah, I know. There's certain things that we will not be doing. I definitely don't think I'm going to be going to theater anytime soon, or indoor.
No raves. No house parties.
Restaurants. I haven't been going to restaurants. Obviously you haven't either. I've been cooking and I went to a couple since I've been, we've been allowed to. And I have to say, I prefer my cooking now. I don't really want to eat in a restaurant. I'm not finding the things that I want to eat. So
I'd want a very large gap around me wherever I went.
Yeah.
Just being close, it's become almost instinctive now. So
yeah, exactly. It's absolutely instinctive. I will never touch a doorknob again. even though apparently that's not where you're catching it. I always
Oh,
pull my sleeve down to open the door.
I'm okay with doorknobs.
Okay, all right, yeah. I don't want to
It's,
be sneezed upon either, but yeah, being up close to somebody, no, yeah, kind of weird.
one of the issues, not so much here, but certainly in Britain, the government in its initial fumblings was always invoking the science. They say we're doing the science. And I think this was like a sort of Gresham's law. It devalued science.
Yeah.
Because what they were quoting wasn't science, it was politically suspect statistics culled by think tanks.
Yeah.
So, you know, what do you think about the statistical approach to herd immunity, chances of, you know,
Well, we know
population?
we know that the CDC was being pressured to change its numbers. I mean, that's what happened. That's why Michael Caputo and his buddy HHS, what's his name, Paul Alexander, who wasn't even like a medical doctor, and they had him in charge of this whole thing at HHS, and then his aide de camp, who was trained by Roger Stone as a communicator at the CDC or at the HHS. These guys were like working to literally change the death numbers. It's, you know, a document, mortality bill or something that the CDC's put together, and it's called the Holy of Holies. Like the science is just, you just don't touch the numbers, and they were messing with them. No, you're counting people who didn't really die of COVID in here. You know, I mean, because that's a right-wing talking point from very early on. Republicans that I knew would say, oh, you know, hospitals are getting paid more if they, the hospitals are getting paid more if they claim a death was COVID as opposed to a heart attack or something. So they're doing that, you know, and how do you answer that kind of baloney, right? I mean, and so you had all these people believing that. Oh yeah, hospitals, they're taking money to claim the deaths of COVID. So they would inflate the numbers so that the elites could, you know, carry on.
In fact, it was, if anything, it seemed to be the other way around, that people who died probably of COVID, but nobody could afford to test, were being diagnosed as dead for other reasons.
Absolutely. You know, it's the other way around. That there was the story the other day that NPR had on there's a new study out of Washington State where they're saying now they think the numbers actually more, the deaths from COVID are closer to 900,000. It's vastly undercounted.
It's the surplus death rate that counts.
Yes, they're counting this. Yes, that's what they're looking at.
How many people died last year? How many people died this year? Are there any other causes for it? Was there a major train crash or a nuclear explosion in the Midwest? No. Maybe they died because of COVID, which we know was happening.
But the overlords might not share all that information.
And also, as you point out, there's no national system for collecting statistics. I'm sure many of the deaths in India are not, those bodies in the sand on the Ganges are unrecorded in any statistics.
I'm sure that's the case there, and I'm sure that's the case here. I mean, these little hospitals here in this community, upstate New York, Pennsylvania, I don't know, people there, the health situation in this area is historically bad. It's very unhealthy area, a lot of poverty, and they, you know, they're not getting their counted. Anyway, yeah.
Mm-hmm. From a reporter's point of view, I mean, you did a mixture of historical research, you did live reporting, you got hold of some of the key players, and you did this while locked down.
Yeah,
to a large extent. I mean,
I didn't do. This isn't really a.
You weren't putting feet indoors because people would have chopped them off.
I wasn't putting feet indoors, and I would say this is again a lot of. I relied on a lot of our daily reporting that had come out. I had an assistant at Stanford, microbiologist, science, helping me with the science, but I also had her help me with timelines, how things happen and in what order. And some of the her early timeline work, she sent me an email and she said, I feel like I'm being pelted with WTFs all over again because we forgot all these things that happened. So a lot of it was just looking at the reporting and trying to tell a very clear story of how what just happened to us, because we were in a panic. We were we were disoriented, and we couldn't keep track of what they were doing. And now I've put it in order. So I interviewed people, I used existing reporting, and I applied my own. And I read a number of excellent books on vaccines, and some other books that have to do with that I refer to in here. The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's a terrific book by Zuboff. I recommend her to you. It's a really interesting book, but I came in at the towards the end where I talk about this whole paranoia about vaccine cards and people being tracked. They don't want they don't want a vaccine card. They don't want to have to tell people whether, where they are, whether they've had, what kind of medical care they've had. And yet every single person in this country, Republican or Democrat, white, brown, whatever, child, adult, we're carrying around these devices that are tracking every single thing we're doing at all times. We are not untracked. We're surveilled, as she calls it, the age of it's capitalist surveillance. It's mercantile. It's to help companies sell us stuff. But we're tracked. This data, personal data, there are like 50,000 data points on all of us. You don't hear anybody complaining about that. But oh no, don't ask me about my vaccine status. It's ridiculous.
I'm sure that anyone can triangulate their way into our medical records. I've always assumed, I've given up on these things. I assume that everything I do is completely transparent if anyone wants to know.
Exactly.
I'm protected by the fact there's too many of us and I'm not that important. And
exactly. I'm not
it would
that
be very boring. I'll try to make it interesting for the people who are watching us. We are coming towards the end now. Which vaccine did you have, by the way?
I had the Moderna, and that was very interesting, cool, because I interviewed one of the top inventors, and he's one of the C-suite guys, Bob Langer, who's got a lab up at MIT, the biggest lab in the world, actually. He's a chemical engineer. Anyway, he's got like 900 patents. They call him the Edison of medicine. The things that he's invented are amazing. And I got to talk to him. He's this very affable. Did
he autograph your hypodermic?
No, because of course we can't see each other. I talked to him like I'm talking to you. He was up in Boston and I was here, but yeah, the first so yeah, my experience was the first one, kind of hurt. Second one, I went in and they were telling everybody there was getting their second, and then they listed out all the side effects, which I knew what they were, but they listed a whole bunch more, and it kind of felt like, oh no, this isn't good. It could make you throw up, or you can have big old lymph node swellings, and don't get a mammogram after this for a month because you might be all lymph node
positive.
And so I did. I was very paranoid about it. And I got the second one, and I came home, and I did feel pretty rotten for like 36 hours. That said, it's a small price to pay for the sense of liberation that this gave me. I mean, while I was sitting there, actually, I bought a ticket. The tickets to Miami on that day were $42 round trip. And it was a cold, rainy, raining day in Hudson. I got it up in Hudson Valley because there weren't any around here. And I got on my phone and I thought, I'll just buy a $42 round trip ticket to Florida because maybe I can go there in a couple months. And I did. I got on an airplane and I went down and stayed at a friend's house and got warm.
Hope you didn't consort with the maskless wonders on the beach.
There were maskless wonders everywhere down there, and idiots who had come down from New York anyway, that's a whole other story. But as far as I know, they also were getting tested and vaccinated down there. Certainly the senior citizens and who I was hanging out with, most of them were older, they had been vaccinated.
Yeah, but they're the brainy ones. Okay, well, this is Ian Williams with the Foreign Press Association, and we've been talking to our colleague Nina Burleigh, who is. Have you got a job at the moment? Are you still with Newsweek?
No, I haven't been with them for over a year and a half now, more than a year and a half, really.
Okay.
No, you can say I'm an adjunct faculty at NYU. That's my.
But
you know what I'm doing now? I'm making documentaries. I've been an executive producer on 2 documentaries now. The money's better and you work half as much or less than half as much.
Send us the details.
It's going to be good, and it's going to be out in June, but I can't tell you what it is yet. It's a big one.
Okay. Well, thanks, Nina, distinguished colleague journalists, rapporteur, reporter, etc., and unvaccinated, so we can talk to her in person soon, we hope. She's a neighbor of mine. When she's not hiding up in the mountains, I could almost knock on the wall into the next building.
Pebbles at each other's windows.
Yes. So, okay, Nina, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Picture of me on your wall, painted red, painted dark, painted tall. Draw a tall, strong man with a strong, strong face. Draw a tall, strong